Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you, as always. Something for you to consider before you listen to this episode. What is your favorite thing about technology? And what's your least favorite? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. Social media companies and big technology, or big tech, as it's often referred to, they're at the forefront of our minds these days, as they so often are. But in particular, as this episode drops, we're talking about Elon Musk's bid to take over Twitter, one of the most popular and well-known social media networks in the world, really. As I look out across the social media landscape, I see opinions on all sides, often extreme, and quite often being, or at least appearing to be, a real rush to judgment before we even know many of the specifics. Now, the particular moment in history that we're living through right now is perfect for the conversation that I'm bringing to you this week here on the follow-up question. This week, I'm talking with two of the three co-authors of the book System Error: Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. I'm talking with Jeremy Weinstein and Mehran Sahami. Rob Reich, the third author, couldn't make it to our conversation, and I regret that, but Mehran and Jeremy and I still have a fantastic conversation about technology and the advancement of technology, and the fact that not enough of us, it appears to be, are asking enough questions, love that part, about technology's role in our lives. And perhaps most importantly, the biggest question being, yes, I understand that we can do these things with technology, but should we? Is disruption a good thing? What is the value of our privacy? Is optimizing every aspect of our lives through the use of technology a good thing? Has social media been a net positive or a net negative for our lives as human beings? The book that Jeremy and Mehran and Rob wrote is a book filled with questions. And I love that so many of these questions are left open-ended or unanswered, perhaps, that these three authors put these questions out there to begin to get us to think about and consider them rather than just blanket accept any new technology that comes into our lives. Let me explain what I mean by telling you a story. I used to work for a government software company that sold citizen engagement or community engagement software into communities to gather public input. And yes, I realize the irony of me talking about the subject of technology and our acceptance of it when I worked at a company that tried to replace in-person public meetings with online technology. I get that. But in one particular instance with one community that we were working with, they were trying to solve the parking issue in their downtown. And so they asked citizens for their ideas. Now, community leaders were very scared that citizens would simply say, well, get rid of the parking meters. I want to park downtown for free. But something fascinating happened. Yes, of course, they got several of those comments that we need to just have free downtown parking. But most often, the most requested thing that citizens asked for downtown was credit card readers on the parking meters. They didn't want the parking meters to go away. Citizens wanted an easier way to pay for the parking. Because if you think about it, if parking is free, then it's so much more difficult to get a parking spot close to your favorite restaurant or your favorite local business. It's frustrating to see the same car parked in the same spot for hours and hours and hours and never having to move. And I tell you this story of the parking meters in this community because one of the technologies that the three authors of this book discuss in the book is a parking app that helps you get out of parking tickets. The consequences of whether to use technology in one way or to use it in another, and who all is affected by that, including the citizens that use the technology. I know I'm going deep on this subject, but the answers aren't always as clear as they appear to be at first. That's the point that I'm driving at with this. As we have all seen with Twitter in particular, and that is certainly the topic of the day, but many other forms of technology, not just social media, there is often a push to extend the boundaries of what is capable and what we can do and what we can achieve. And then there is often a backlash to rein things in once we understand the consequences. And as Jeremy, Mehran, and Rob pose it in their book, can we flip that so that we're considering, should we? Yes, I know that we can, but should we move forward with the development of this technology, whatever it happens to be? It's a fascinating read. Again, I love all the questions, and I hope you enjoy the conversation here with Jeremy and Mehran. I was struck by how many great questions you all wrote in the book. You know, is a problem worth solving? What makes disruption valuable? What is our privacy worth? And my question to both of you, and perhaps Mehran, we'll start with you. My question is, how did it come to pass that you began considering these questions that you then ask in the book? What was the buildup there?
Well, this whole project started about 5 years ago, where the three of us came together to think about what was happening in terms of trends of students on campus, seeing a great migration of students moving toward engineering. To give you the compressed version of that story, we thought it was necessary to bring more of a discussion around values and policies into the technology sphere, because some of the things that we were seeing happening in terms of students graduating and moving out into the workplace, we felt that they weren't sufficiently armed in some sense with an understanding of some of the social issues, some of the values that were being encoded in the technologies that they were building. And so we came together originally to teach a class, and we spent a year working together, doing research, figuring out structure, and then actually taught a version of the course, which we've now done. We're in our fourth iteration of that course now. While we were doing it, that allowed us to hone some of the ideas, to hone the questions that we wanted students to grapple with. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that we want to get these ideas out to a broader audience, which was the impetus for writing the book. And in terms of writing that book and trying to make these ideas and questions accessible to a broader audience, it really required trying to crystallize more of what those questions were, making it clear what the value trade-offs are when we consider a choice, like what is the value of your privacy? You have to consider, where that value comes from. Why is it important to you? How do you trade that value off against other things that you might also care about? When are you willing to give up some of your privacy to get something else like security? And so we wanted people to be able to more broadly grapple with these questions because they're immersed in technology. They need to form their own opinions and their own values of these things if they're going to navigate the technological sphere that they're going to be existing in.
And Jeremy, yeah.
Let me jump in on that and sort of put an even finer point on some of what Mehran communicated. So I'm the social scientist of the author trio and the guy who spent, a good part of my career working in public policy settings. And one of the things that I was really grappling with is the extraordinary certainty that the new crop of technologists seemed to have, that the missions that they were aspiring to and the products that they were building were good for the world. And I think when you listed some of those questions that we're asking, like, is this a problem worth solving? And what's the value of privacy? And how do we think about whether connecting people everywhere is beneficial, and to what extent do we want to go all in on free speech, given the potential consequences of amplified speech on the platforms? All these questions that we're asking are questions that challenge that certainty, right? Where there is no right answer to any of the questions that are posed in the book. And so part of what's been interesting for us about teaching technologists is that technologists struggle with questions that don't have a right answer, right? They're used to optimizing a particular function. They're used to writing clean code and being told you did this right or you did this wrong. But the kinds of issues that we are grappling with in the United States and around the world around technology, none of these questions have a right answer or a wrong answer. They have issues that we need to deliberate on as a collective. And in doing that, we all need to develop and articulate normatively held views about the kind of society that we want to live in. And that pierces the certainty that I felt that we were seeing among young technologists, whether they were graduating from Stanford or running companies just down the street.
And Jeremy, to follow up on that, what's been the response in the classes that you three have taught from those students? What has been the feedback, the response when you ask these tough questions?
People are uncomfortable. I mean, this is a moment where the relationship between technologists and their profession is very much being threatened and challenged by the evolving view of technology in the public domain. 10 years ago, if you got a job at Facebook or Google or Apple, you were celebrated. If you created a startup company and raised your seed capital round or your Series A round and found yourself on Fast Company's 30 under 30, people were like, you're amazing, right? That's the best thing that people could aspire to. But in a world in which Cambridge Analytica happens as an extraordinary violation of people's privacy, the interference in the 2016 election, all of the issues that we've confronted around content moderation under Donald Trump's presidency, the displacement of labor, the poor treatment of gig workers. I mean, it's no longer the case that sort of saying you're going to a big tech company gets you a pat on the back and everyone wants a sweatshirt. People actually feel the ambivalence about, on the one hand, the extraordinary superpowers they have with the tools of the 21st century, but on the other hand, the harms that are now apparent that are directly attributable to the choices that either technologists are making as they build products or companies are making as they roll out products into the world. And so we are tapping in to that feeling of discomfort. And for some people, the best response is to say, yeah, I took my medicine, I heard you, but I really love AI and I want to be on the frontiers of machine learning, and I'm going to go into a company and I'm going to, do what it takes to be the most successful, individual doing advanced machine learning, on DeepMind. But for others, they're left with a sense of sort of question asking, right? A recognition that they exist in powerful structures that are shaping what they're optimizing for or who the products are being sold to, and they're finding themselves asking those questions. And then there's a third group that looks at the issues that we're putting on the table and says, I want to lean into this space. And I want to figure out what it means to bring these debates about values into my role as an entrepreneur, into my role as a technologist. I want to explore policy pathways where I could exercise influence. I want to mobilize and energize my classmates and citizens and neighbors and family around these issues. So we're getting that full range of reactions. And one of the virtues of being at this institution, which is one of the top 5 providers of talent into the innovation ecosystem of Silicon Valley, is that, teaching 300, 350 students a year, especially CS majors, we're generating all of those reactions and injecting it every year into the ecosystem.
Mehran, being on the front lines, as Jeremy just intimated there, being on the front lines of so many technologists entering the job market and entering the world post their education, behaviorally, what have you seen any changes? Is it too early to see behavioral changes in how they're actually performing their jobs? Are we there yet? Or perhaps said another way, what behaviorally would need to change for this to have real effect, these types of questions that you're asking?
We've already seen some behavioral change, and I think we need to see more. I think what we're seeing is a ball rolling that is gathering momentum over time. Some of the behavioral change we've seen is we've had students tell us that the choice, for example, of their employer, where they wanted to go work, was influenced by the discussions that were had in class, some of the things that they hadn't considered before, some of the value trade-offs, the particular sorts of ways that particular companies were making those value trade-offs that they may have felt uncomfortable with. We also see students who are taking a more critical look at the tech sector overall and thinking about, can I apply my skills in different ways, as opposed to, say, going to a big tech company? Could I actually get involved in a policy pathway? Because I think of policy as being a way that can help improve the technological ecosystem for everyone if we can build some guardrails about some of these technologies that we feel very uncomfortable with. I think at a deep level, what we're finding a lot of students resonating with is it's no longer sufficient to basically say, I'm just an engineer, and only think about the technical issues when they make their decisions about where they're going to go work or what they're going to do or the impact that they have on the world. In some sense, we have challenged them. They need to be challenged, and they are taking that mantle and challenging themselves to go outside of their comfort zone to learn more. And ultimately, we leave them with questions that they have to grapple with as individuals. What is your responsibility when you choose to build a piece of technology? What can you do about it other than just being an engineer somewhere? How can you potentially get involved in bringing these issues to light at a company to change their decision-making process? How can you get involved with other ways of exercising your agency? And these are the broader set of perspectives that we want to bring to students and that we're seeing students act on at some level now. But I think in the long term, these are questions that all engineers are going to have to grapple with.
Mehran, you mentioned public policy, and Jeremy, you did as well. I'm struck by, and I was struck by in reading the book, how often when the big tech company CEOs get in front of Congress and we all poke and laugh and make fun of the government officials and the questions that they ask of those CEOs, why do we not then turn around and apply the same scrutiny to tech companies' lack of understanding of government process and public policy creation?
Well, partly I'd say that the tech companies are getting exactly what they want out of government right now. So instead of laughing at their misunderstanding, the reality is that for tech companies, they've existed in a regulatory oasis since 1995 with almost no oversight of the market concentration that's happened, the privacy violations that have unfolded, their content moderation policies and the like. So, from that perspective, the tech companies are making out like bandits. And of course, that's the issue that we're trying to bring to the fore in the book, which is that when values are in tension with one another and there are trade-offs, like the trade-off between privacy and security, or between privacy and personalized service delivery, or the tension that we see between the amplification of free speech on the platforms and the health of our information ecosystem, when these values are in tension with one another, the right locus for decision-making is not the mind of the engineer on his own or her own building the product. The right locus of decision-making is not in the C-suite corporate boardroom. It's actually in our collective decision-making process, which is our democracy. And the thing I want to say just about the examples that are held up that, caricature our elected politicians, it's easy to point fingers, at those particular examples. The story that you're referencing that we tell in the book is Mark Zuckerberg going to Congress and Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah trying to figure out, well, how does Facebook make money when you give away your product for free? Of course, that's a question that anyone who's paying any attention knows the answer to, which is that you're the product and Facebook's selling your private information. and making much more money than they would in a subscription service. But the truth about our government is much more nuanced. And I guess I'd say two things about it. The first is that there are actually tons of people bringing expertise to the table for a far more nuanced and deep understanding than what's in public display. The investigation into anti-competitive practices that was led by both House Democrats and Republicans that finished about a year and a half ago out of the House Judiciary Committee generated a slew of pieces of legislation that are deeply informed, not misinformed, but deeply informed. And those are increasingly the starting point for conversations in Washington. But the second thing to say is, if you look at government and you think these folks don't have the technical expertise that's needed to kind of govern the technological frontier, the next question you should ask yourself is why? And the answer is not because government is preordained to be technically illiterate. It's because we've created a government that's technically illiterate because of what we pay and who we recruit and the way in which during the Gingrich Revolution, we actually decommissioned and broke down all of our institutional expert bodies that offered scientific perspective to legislators. That's the government that we've chosen, not the government that necessarily should exist. And so that's on us. That's on us as citizens. That's on us as people who can exercise our voice and influence. If you want a government that's better able to navigate technology, then elect people to Washington who bring that expertise to the table, demand that expertise of your elected officials, and let's reform our government institutions so that they can actually be on the frontier.
Mehran, I'd love your thoughts on that as well. What is the onus of us as users of these technologies? The example that I always point to is people perhaps not understanding the difference between a publicly traded company and a public organization in terms of a government entity and the ramifications that has on freedom of speech. What do we as users of this technology, what onus is on us?
It's a great question. And if you consider sort of the difference between what the kind of pass that many private technology companies get with things like the kind of data that they can gather about people or how they can use that data versus the sort of regulations we have in the public sphere and public agencies gathering of data, you can see a pretty stark contrast. And part of that is that the technology sector, the private technology sector, comes from a very libertarian ethos, a notion of we're here to innovate. If you're going to regulate, what you're going to do is you're going to hamper our ability to innovate. And that's how they cast that sort of dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy, but oftentimes that's how it gets cast. And so the take that they have is what we want is the free market to decide. We'll put out a set of products and we'll give individuals the choice as to whether or not they want to use the product or not use the product. And so what you're left with are these individual choices that says either I can choose to use a product, or if I do choose a product, there are maybe some small settings they give me. Like I can set some privacy settings in my application if I can figure out what they are. I can decide whether or not to accept cookies from a website or not. I can try to use a web browser that has incognito mode as opposed to just a regular mode with respect to what information about me gets tracked. But if you notice in all those situations, what's happening is the onus is placed on the consumer. The tech company says, you know what? You have to choose. And what it doesn't give you is it belies the notion of the fact that we could have a regulatory structure that creates guardrails for everyone. And kind of the analogy that we often like to use is the roadway system. When cars were first invented, you had a choice to drive or not to drive. But if there were no regulations of the road, we'd get all kinds of accidents, people would die, which is actually what happened in the early days of the advent of automotive technology. So what happened? We created a regulatory structure that says we're going to have lanes. We're going to tell people which side of the road to drive on. We're going to put in things like stop signs and stop lights and speed bumps around schools. You still have a choice whether or not you want to drive and the choices you make while driving as an individual. But we have a regulatory system that creates safety for everyone driving. We don't have that same analogy in technology right now. And what we need to get to is a place where we have some sensible regulations around things like data privacy and control for an individual to understand the technologies that are being used on them. to create a sense of safety and awareness. And they can still then make choices as to what technology they use and what privacy settings they set, but it's done in a larger scope that guarantees everyone is having a better experience.
Jeremy, Mehran just brought up the point of, this innovation is stifled by regulation, and we need to be more free, kind of that libertarian mindset of we need to be more free to innovate and grow these things. Why in your belief, and you certainly illustrated in the book, but why does that belief not hold up to scrutiny in your mind?
Well, I think the core reason it doesn't hold up to scrutiny is that every market is underlied by a set of rules, right? And so, when people paint, it's like either the market or the state, right? The idea that there's some thing called a free and unfettered market, that operates anywhere just isn't the case, right? Even things as important and basic as property rights and contracts, which are critical to the effective functioning of the market, or transparency provisions and accountability to shareholders that govern the publicly traded companies that you described. Like, these are all rules, and these are rules that come from government. So, we exist in a part of the country where regulation has a bad name. And what I remind our students is that regulation is just another word for democracy. What regulation are the set of decisions that all of us make collectively about the guardrails that we want to build around private sector institutions that, yes, generate innovations, but also potentially generate social harms. And so if you care about clean water or clean air, you think, yes, I want companies that generate energy to power my house, but I also want some governance of the emissions that they put into the atmosphere because I want my kids to be able to breathe. And I don't really have alternative energy options, although that's changing. But we exist with a set of utilities that are powerful, that determine what energy mix is available to us. And we say as a society, yes, we want energy, but we also want air that our kids can breathe. And that is totally appropriate for a political community to decide. And it's not left to the choices of consumers to decide what energy company they work with. We recognize that this collective thing called the health of our planet is something that we care about. It is no different when it comes to the consequences of what's happening in the tech sector for our privacy, for people's ability to find meaningful and well-compensated work, for the health of our information ecosystem, for our sense of fairness and justice in society. All of these values that we care about, are experiencing negative harms as the result of choices that are happening in the private market. And consumers are insufficiently powerful on their own to address those social harms because these are systemic effects, but also because there's very little competition in the tech sector. And so when you put those two things together, you recognize that there is a role for regulation, but let's call regulation what it is, which is that this is our democratic institutions refereeing the value tensions that people in society have, the different preferences that we bring to the table, and trying to arrive at the best possible outcome. And that's why, as much as we criticize tech companies in the book, and we have a lot to say about where tech companies go wrong, we're equally critical of our democratically elected politicians and of citizens who fail to hold our politicians accountable, because ultimately we have, all of us, extraordinary power to influence the way this game plays out.
Mehran, is it enough to say, I can opt out of this? I don't have to use Google. I can use another search engine. I don't have to use Facebook. I can not be on social media, as a lot in my generation, millennial and younger, are opting out of Facebook. Is it enough to just say, I can opt out of this influence?
Well, the reason why these technological companies have gotten so large is because they provide real value to people. So if the only choice you give someone is to opt out or not, is basically saying, do you get value from this or not? To go back to the car driving analogy, it's like saying, oh, you know what, there's accidents on the road. You could just choose not to drive, period, right? Is that a valid choice, right? What you're doing is you're creating the situation for someone that says you have to give up something that has value to you, right? And there's truth in that. There's value to using search engines to find information we care about. There's value to being on social networks to connect with friends and family, We're not saying that value goes away. What we're trying to say is the import of that value and weighed with the import of other values for a person themselves that they might care about, like having a healthy information ecosystem, not being polarized, being able to find information that is not biased, being able to protect their privacy while they're browsing the web. Those are things that we need to ensure while still giving someone choice. And if the only choice we give them is you have to give up all these other values you care about in order to get some of the values of information finding or participating in a social network, what we're creating is, in some sense, a much more impoverished choice than we could otherwise have. We should be able to get value while at least having some safeguards around other things that we care about.
Jeremy, go ahead. You look like you wanted to comment there.
I mean, let me make it even more plain. Like, imagine you go off the grid. You're like, I'm going to have nothing to do with this social media ecosystem. But you still live in a country whose information flows are profoundly shaped and informed by what's happening in this new digital public sphere. You don't get to walk away from that just because you personally go off the grid, right? You could decide that you're not going to use Uber or Lyft because you don't like how those companies treat workers. But just because you make that decision, it doesn't change the fact that Uber and Lyft and the general structure of the gig economy that doesn't provide protections for workers then lays at the foot of the state, right? Government dealing with the consequences of the failure of companies to provide for their workers. You don't get to walk away from that. That shows up in your taxes. And so this is why the notion of externalities is so important, that there are a set of social effects, regardless of whether you are a player in the system, regardless of whether you consume the products, that are going to affect your quality of life. And the locus for decision-making when we have these kinds of social effects is not in the boardroom. It's not in the code base, right? It's basically in politics.
I believe you both posed the question in the book, what do we offer those who are left behind? And that kind of flows into that. What is left behind when we focus too much on disruption and optimization and efficiency, these things that you deem as the kind of technologist mindset or goals in and of themselves to be more efficient, more optimized, more disruptive? What do we leave behind? What do we miss when those become the focus? Jeremy, I'll pose that question to you.
Well, I'm going to answer it one way, and Mehran, will likely want to add other things to the answer.
Absolutely.
This is at the crux of the book, right? An engineer's mindset around optimization and the way in which the venture capital industry and the lack of regulation fuel whatever it is that engineers are choosing to optimize, right? And turn that into something that has consequences for all of us. Because these technologies aren't rolled out to 50 people, right? Actually, the incentives of venture capital mean that the incentives to dominate the market very quickly turn what could be modest harmful effects into big social consequences. So I want to pick up one particular angle, which is, who do we think is making these decisions, right? Who are the people who are building the technologies? Who are the people that are financing them? Who are the people in the boardrooms? And what blind spots do they have because of their own lived experience, right? What kinds of problems are being solved in this space? And what are the questions that aren't even being asked, right? One of the issues that we teach about in our course and write about in the book is the challenge that algorithmic decision-making systems, which offer us extraordinary power that gets beyond the capability of human cognition to do really difficult tasks and to do it with a level of accuracy, that is, superhuman, right? For example, how should Amazon make its way through tens of thousands of job applications every day to figure out who are the best people to hire? You can automate that entire process. But if you are not a woman or a person of color, are you attentive when you build that algorithm to the way in which discrimination against people from marginalized groups has been central not only to how people have been hired in the past, but also how people are promoted within companies? And so when Amazon discovers, in a story that we tell in the book, that their hiring algorithm is fundamentally discriminatory against women, and they can't do anything with the world's smartest engineers to erase the discriminatory behavior of the algorithm, why do we think that these kinds of concerns get surfaced? And they generally get surfaced by individuals who right now do not have much voice in the system, right? Because if you look at who's hired into technology, you look at who the CEOs and leaders are, you look at who benefits from venture capital funding, it's largely people of privilege, largely people in the dominant, racial and identity groups in the country. And so, at the core, the people whose problems are going to be solved and the things that are going to be missed are going to be a function of that lived experience and perspective. And we know that that perspective is not encompassing of all of the interests and perspectives that exist in the United States or around the world.
Mehran, I'd love your perspective on that as well.
Sure. I guess just to add a different facet to it is thinking about the notion of optimization as basically indexing on a particular value. When someone chooses to optimize something, they have to make a choice about what is being optimized. That's often some sort of numeric measure that's a proxy for the thing they might really care about in the world. But when you choose to make that the particular criteria for optimization, what you're really doing is you're saying there's a particular value I care about. To give you an example, if we think about, say, end-to-end encryption technologies that we might have on our phone, or we might use an app like Signal, what that's doing is it's placing a very high value on privacy. And that could be great if privacy is the only thing you care about. But if you're a citizen living in a nation, you might also care about things like having security from terrorists or criminals who might be using those same platforms to be able to communicate without any kind of ability for law enforcement to see what they're doing. You might care about the fact that human traffickers and child pornographers are sending information through those networks to carry out what they want to do, and there's no way of being able to break into those networks. And so it brings up this question of when you are taking a particular value and making it the prime value, who gets to make that decision? Is it just because some engineer in a room decided that they cared about privacy, that the rest of us are subjected to the externalities that happen as a result? And there's lots of examples of this over and over. YouTube, for example, optimizes on the amount of time people spend watching videos because they view the fact that we're watching those videos as meaning we must be happy watching the videos and it's an intrinsic good. When I look at my two teenage kids watching videos all day, I don't think of it as an intrinsic good. I don't think they should be optimized to spend as much time watching videos as possible. But who made that value trade-off? It wasn't me. It was someone at a company that decided that was the thing that they were going to optimize for. That was the behavior that they wanted their algorithms to target and further optimize. Right? It generates revenue for them. And you see this play out over and over again. And so when we get back to that question of how do we take the values that we as a society care about and try to infuse them into these technology platforms, we realize we need to have a broader set of regulation, a broader set of guidelines. Because if we just leave it up to the marketplace, we get these choices that leave us with products that are denigrating the values we care about because they're just promoting the values that a very small fraction of the world cares about, namely the executives and engineers of those companies that are building the systems.
How do the students that you teach who are going into the workforce and going into work for these tech companies not feel as if they are not capable of making this kind of a change? How do they go out into the world and say, I'm going to bring this different way of looking, this asking questions mindset to the workplace and feel like it can tackle the behemoth questions that you all are posing in this book? Is that possible for them? Mehran, I'll pose that question to you.
Well, maybe I'll take a first start, and I'm sure Jeremy will have more to say about this. I think part of it is making the people who are going out into the workforce feel a certain sense of responsibility and discomfort about the things that they are actually building, to raise questions and to realize that it's easy to think about some of the large technology companies that exist as these big behemoths and they're unchangeable. But really, what is a company? It has no soul in itself. All a company is a conglomeration of people that are making decisions. right? And so what happens? New people come into that process. They can help make decisions. They can help inform other people that are making decisions and help to move this. It can be it can be a slow moving ship, but they need to move it in a particular direction. And the more that they are aware of the issues that are involved, these value trade-offs, the way that technology puts a thumb on the scale of different kinds of values, that it's not neutral in itself, which oftentimes people like to say, well, technology is just neutral. Understanding that it's not, because it actually promotes certain values and not others. Being aware of that when they're making choices for technology, when they're doing their jobs, when they're interacting with their colleagues, and ultimately when they're citizens and taking place in the political process, are all ways that they can move the ship. So I think there's a lot of ways to have agency. It's just a matter of understanding what that agency is and how people can plug into the process.
I love hearing Mehran talk like this because, as you know, our third co-author, our philosopher, is not with us today. But Mehran could really pass as a philosopher in this conversation, and that's part of the importance in the book of bringing together a technical perspective, a philosophical and normative perspective, and a policy perspective. I mean, one other thing the philosopher would say if he was here is that, it's not a good life to go through the world morally sleepwalking, right? And so, yes, we're making our students profoundly uncomfortable about their complicity in the outcomes that are generated by the technologies that they build. But the alternative to feeling complicit and uncomfortable is to be blind to what's happening. And that's not a better outcome. So once you accept that we're complicit, all of us are complicit. Even if I don't work in a technology company, I'm complicit in the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States, right? I'm complicit in, persistent patterns of discrimination because I've been unable to change some of the institutions that I've worked in, whether it's in the public sector or in higher education. So we're all complicit in various ways. I'm complicit in the destruction of the planet because of the amount of power that I use at home. So complicity is just a fact of adulthood. It's a fact of life. And we need to get our students over the freedom that comes with blindness, right? The sense of release that comes with blindness, have them sit in the stew of complicity. And then once they've sat in that stew, begin to think, as Mehran does, about what it means to reclaim your agency. And we need to do that in tractable ways. It's not the job of a 22-year-old going into a big company like Meta or Google to resolve all of the core questions at the crux of our book. But they do have a responsibility to ask the question, who is this product designed for? What might we be missing? Who are the stakeholders who might be affected by our rollout of the product in the world? How are we choosing the customers to whom we sell this product? What are the potential harms that we haven't yet talked about, and how do we mitigate them? Those are the responsibilities I want our students to take into the world. And that's the alternative to just casually accepting blinders over our eyes about this complicity that all of us live with.
Jeremy, how much harder are those questions to ask in a society where our values seem to be diverging? And much of that is being blamed on big technology for various reasons, whether socially or politically. How much harder is that job made when we can't even agree on what we value?
We can't even agree on facts, much less what we value.
Right.
You're absolutely right. This is a profoundly difficult moment in the United States, especially one that is marked by extraordinary polarization, extraordinary institutional dysfunction. And as we discuss in some of the chapters of the book, we think that the rise and growth of big tech has something to do with that. It's put it on steroids in various ways. That said, it's kind of striking right now that one of the things that you can get both Democrats and Republicans to agree on in Washington is that big tech has too much power, and that power needs to be reclaimed by our political institutions. So even at a moment of just tremendous dissensus on so many issues, you're getting bipartisan pieces of legislation to address things like privacy, to address things like data portability, to think about the anti-competitive practices of a small number of companies, because we are at an anti-elite moment in the United States, and both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party appreciate the importance of challenging entrenched power in various ways. And so I actually think optimistically that we're at the beginning of the opening of a policy window. That's a kind of nerdy social scientific term for that moment when the needs of society that demand some kind of policy response come together with an alignment of incentives and actors to bring about change. And I think we're entering a 10-year period where we're going to see a dramatic reorganization of the relationship between government and big tech companies. And even if Washington can't get there, and I do think Washington is going to get there, although it will come in fits and starts, it's already happening in Europe and it's already happening in California. And if you want to think about two big markets that are going to make big tech companies wake up to the need to referee these value trade-offs in different ways, take the European Union and California, the sixth or seventh largest economy in the world by the size of GDP. Both of them have moved on privacy. Both of them are moving on transparency around algorithmic decision-making. California is trying to move on the treatment of gig workers. And so the landscape is changing. So whatever dysfunction you see in the world or polarization that concerns you, get into the details, get beneath the headline that nothing can happen and no one can agree, and get into the details because stuff is happening. And we need to shape those outcomes in a way that reflect our preferences.
Mehran, what questions can I, as an everyday citizen who does happen to work at a tech company on the marketing side, but what questions should we be asking ourselves as we try to influence this in our own way?
Well, at one level, actually being a worker at a tech company, you have a lot more power than the average citizen. But if we think about the average citizen and what kind of questions they can ask, there are the basic questions where there's the notion that you're given right now, right? That choice of whether or not you want to use particular applications or you want to engage with a particular kind of the economy. Like, do you want to take rides on Lyft or Uber? Or do you want to try supporting your local taxi cab drivers? But I think at a larger level is trying to understand what are the dynamics that are at work. What does it mean for the other people in your community when wages get suppressed or depressed because there is now more gig economy workers? What does that mean for them? What does that mean for their healthcare when they're not treated like employees? How does that influence your decisions? Understanding what information you're giving up and what is the value of that information. So when you spend time online and now suddenly you're bombarded with a bunch of other information that people are trying to sell you things, are there alternative choices that you could have made in terms of, some of the technologies that you actually used? But again, it gets back to that point that if you don't like the fact that you're bombarded with this stuff, you don't like the fact that you're the one who has to be on constant surveillance of yourself and what information you're giving up, that should motivate you to say you need to get into the game. Because technology should not just be seen as a wave that washes over us. We shouldn't give up our agency and say, well, I was given these choices about the apps I could use. That's all I should, expect, and that I should be happy with that. Because you will get what you are willing to accept. And what we've come to accept is a notice and choice framework where someone gives us for an app a terms of service that are, if you actually read the terms of service, I think most people don't scroll through the 30 pages of stuff before they just hit OK because they want to, see the cat pictures or whatever the case may be. But the framework that we've accepted so far gives a huge amount of power to the tech companies. It gives us very little. And we've just accepted that because we haven't demanded more. It's gotten to a place where we need to be willing to demand more, not just from the standpoint of individual consumer choices, but from the standpoint of learning about these issues ourselves and then actually getting into the game to help make changes in policy. And to help inform other people in our community to do the same thing and to talk to our friends at tech companies to let them know we care about these things and we'd want to see change.
Gentlemen, as we get near the end of our time here, I want to ask you one final question to both of you. And it's the same question that I ask of all my guests, which is, what is a question that you wish you were asked more? And Mehran, I'd love to start with you. What's a question that you wish you were asked more?
I think one of the questions I wish it would be asked more is actually to think about the details of what's at stake when we think about some of these issues. It's oftentimes the things we get hung up on are just what are sort of the consumer choices I can make, right? And we think about, should I delete Facebook or should I not delete Facebook, right? And really what I'd like someone to ask is, how can I reframe that whole question? Right? How can I think about a world in which that's not the choice I need to deal with? The choice I need to deal with is, how do I engage in a process that makes Facebook something that I'm not considering deleting because it's got the guardrails around it that makes me comfortable to use it? That shouldn't have to be a responsibility for the 2 billion individuals in terms of their choices when they choose an app or not choose an app. Right? If we think about the amount of leverage that we could have by getting some sort of guardrails in place that make things better for all 2 billion of those individuals, that's a pretty powerful concept. That should motivate us to want to actually get into the game and get involved. And so asking the questions about those details, what's at stake, what can we do about it? Those are the things that I wish people would ask more.
Beautiful. And Jeremy, same question to you. What's a question you wish you were asked more?
So I'll tell you the first thing that came to mind, which is how can I help government do a better job of, regulating this technological future? And, for me, that's a question that actually is relevant to everybody. So when I first thought of it, I thought, actually, I wish more of my students asked me that question, right? Because there's such a negative connotation of government in Silicon Valley and on the West Coast. So few of our students would ever contemplate pursuing a career in the public sector, bringing their technological expertise to the public sector, trading off the high salaries that they can earn in Silicon Valley for the modest salaries that our public sector workers earn, but the job satisfaction that comes from serving the public interest. So that was the first way that I was thinking of it. But of course, that question is relevant for all of us, right? Because democracy is this thing, it's a technology itself that we all jointly own. And it only works if we engage in it, right? It only works if we take seriously the responsibility to inform and educate ourselves. It only works if we take seriously the responsibility of informing our elected officials about what we want and holding them accountable when we don't get what we want out of the system. And I think the disengagement from our politics that is so apparent, not just in younger generations, but across the board, is one of our core afflictions in the United States. And it really stands in the way of addressing the kinds of social harms that big tech is generating. So if people are happy right now that technologists making decisions for all of us is producing the kinds of outcomes that you want, then you don't need to do anything. You can keep, sitting on the couch or take a hike in the hills. But if you're unhappy with the kinds of consequences that we're seeing, the disinformation and misinformation that is now contributing to our vaccination crisis in the United States, or continues to contribute to the misunderstandings around climate change, or you're concerned about what the displacement of labor means for those at the lower end of the income distribution or the skills distribution, or you're concerned that people in the United States don't really get a fair shake and that it's getting worse as we move to systems of automated decision-making, then you don't need to accept the status quo. But the question you have to ask is, how can I contribute to a government that's better able to govern our technological future?
Beautiful stuff. Both of you. Great questions. I know I'm going to be thinking about them. I hope the audience does as well. How can people get a hold of the book, get a copy, and follow along with each of your work? Jeremy, I'll turn the question over to you. And Mehran, I'd love to have you say how people can connect with you as well. And if you have information to share about Rob, the third co-author of the book, I'd love to hear that as well.
So you can find the book at all of your local booksellers, as well as the big booksellers online. The book is out with HarperCollins. It came out in September. So feel free to find it definitely from your local bookseller if you can. And in addition, we are actively engaged in kind of generating these conversations all over the country, not just with our students. So feel free to reach out to us at Stanford. You can find my information, Mehran's information, Rob's information on the Stanford website. We're interested in connecting to people who are teaching undergraduates about these issues. We teach ourselves in the evening to professional technologists. So if you want to join that community, if you want to talk about these issues inside your company, we're happy to come visit your company virtually or in person to spur some of these conversations. But this is a moment where we need to inform and educate ourselves, and we see ourselves in that business.
Mehran, anything further to add there?
I mean, just to add, there's a website where you can find most of the information. It's systemerrorbook.com, and that will have the information on all of us as authors of the book. It will have a link about ways to get involved. If there's a link called Take Action. And so you can find out more about the evening class we teach. You can find out about other kinds of events that are coming up. There's a reader's guide there. So if you want to have a book club, or you have a group of folks that want to get together to talk about the book, what are the issues in it, and then what you might be able to do in terms of organizing a small group and organizing a larger group and then taking some bigger actions, I'd go check out that website. And if you want to buy the book, there's also links there as well.
Very good. Gentlemen, I have greatly enjoyed this. I enjoyed the book and all of the questions that you asked. Thank you so much for writing it and for coming on to discuss it. I appreciate it, and best of luck in your work, all right?
Thanks so much for having us. A lot of fun.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So many thanks to Mehran and Jeremy for joining me on the show this week to share their wisdom and perspective and insight. Please do me and Mehran and Jeremy a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share this episode with your network. Please help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Mehran and Jeremy that I have on the show each and every episode, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.